And welcome to POTUS 2016. It's been a fractious week for the GOP presidential hopefuls, fuming over what many saw as a biased and superficial debate on CNBC. The candidates staged a bit of a rebellion. They got together and talked about overruling their own Republican National Committee and rewriting the debate guidelines. Turned out there wasn't much unity there that lasted, but the first draft included a demand for opening and closing statements, equal number of questions for each, and colder air conditioning, really. But what seemed to heat up the candidates most were the CNBC moderators, who were implying that the candidates' tax plans were unrealistic or their competence suspect. 30 minutes in, Texas Senator Ted Cruz had had enough.
You know, let me say something at the outset. The questions that have been asked so far in this debate illustrate why the American people don't trust the media. This is not a cage match. And you look at the questions. Donald Trump, are you a comic book villain? Ben Carson, can you do math? John Kasich, will you insult two people over here? Marco Rubio, why don't you resign? Jeb Bush, why have your numbers fallen? How about talking about the substantive issues people care about?
Now, normally President Obama stays above the campaign fray, but after he heard these candidates complaining about the CNBC moderators, he couldn't resist the opportunity to put them down and raise himself up all at once.
Have you noticed that every one of these candidates say, Obama's weak. He's Putin's kicking sand in his face. When I talk to Putin, he's going to straighten out. Just looking at him, he's going to be. And then it turns out they can't handle a bunch of CNBC moderators at a debate.
The president, who can deliver a line, spoke at a friendly fundraiser in New York. Obama and Cruz aside, though, what might make the debates more, to borrow a phrase, fair and balanced? Our guests will discuss that. The Jeb campaign reboot, we'll discuss that too, and more in a moment. But first, place your bets. Earlier in the week, Dr. Carson appeared to be increasing his lead over Donald Trump, at least nationally. An NBC Wall Street Journal poll published Monday had Carson up by 6 percentage points. But in a recent Morning Consult poll, this time of registered voters rather than likely voters, that's usually not as good a poll because you don't know if they're likely to vote, the numbers show the reverse. Trump an impressive 10 points ahead of Carson. Now let's look at Iowa and New Hampshire, where the first votes, of course, will be held in just a few months. In Iowa, a recent poll conducted by Iowa radio station KBUR and Illinois' Monmouth College poll puts Carson way ahead, 28% to Trump's 20%. And look at how we also see Cruz climbing ahead of Rubio and Bush, perhaps reflecting Cruz's debate performance. But in New Hampshire, the lead flips, once again as Trump is up by 10 points, among likely voters, that is. However, the big news here may be that Rubio has 13%. He's now moved into third place, close behind Carson. And notice how Kasich is in far behind with 11%. Fiorina, despite her previous surge, is doing poorly in the Granite State. But let's not forget the endorsement horse race. Historically, endorsements have been one of the best predictors of the ultimate nominee. With the election a year off, it looks like a bad indicator. However, Jeb Bush in blue still dominates endorsements. Then Chris Christie in green. But as governors and members of Congress chime in, those slices of the pie will thin. And the betting markets favorite, Marco Rubio, just added 2 senators to his endorsement tally in recent weeks. Meanwhile, no major shift in the Democratic polls. Nationally, Hillary Clinton still leads Bernie Sanders nearly 2-1 when you average the polls, and she's way ahead in Iowa. They are, however, neck-and-neck in New Hampshire. What to make of all this? And something else few have noticed, that candidate Lawrence Lessig, the campaign finance reformer, has dropped out of the Democratic race. Joining us, Oren Cass, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, the conservative think tank, and he was domestic policy director for the 2008 Mitt Romney campaign, and Fordham University law professor Zephyr Teachout, who challenged New York Governor Andrew Cuomo in the 2014 primary. She's author of Corruption in America, from Benjamin Franklin's Snuff box to Citizens United, and currently CEO of the campaign finance reforming May Day PAC. Welcome to both of you.
Great to be here.
Zephyr, I'll start with you because the May Day PAC had previously been run by Lawrence Lessig,
Yes.
who, though little known, was running in the Democratic primary race, but now he dropped out. How come?
He dropped out. Actually, it's a little bit of a scandal, I think. The Democratic, the DNC had very clear debate rules, who could get in the debate. And Lessig was clearly running to get in the debate and force other candidates to address the fundamental corruption in our system, how campaigns are financed, instead of just pretending that we have a functioning democracy.
And I will say, the week that he got in, I interviewed him, and he said, hey, look, the rule is if you get just 1% in the polls, you get into the first debates.
So he structured his campaign purposefully to get into the debate, believing that if you get in the debate, then you can actually reach the public and talk about this fundamental issue. Then just a few days ago, the DNC changed the rules, saying he needed to get that 1% in each debate, not in the 6 weeks prior to the debate, but 6 weeks prior to that. So it just shows sort of the DNC arbitrarily shutting people out, and it suggests it suggests a lack of democratic trust on the part of the DNC. O'Malley has rightly also criticized the DNC for holding relatively few debates, and I do think it's a real problem.
Yeah, well, we'll never know if his campaign finance reform is the root of all evil message, or campaign finance is the root of all evil message, would have gained traction over the other contenders. Well, I guess we'll never know.
Well, I will say that he did make a difference in the race. The day, basically, that he joined the race, Hillary Clinton came out with a very strong public financing proposal. She previously hadn't talked about it. Bernie Sanders, who's talked a lot about Citizens United, started then talking about the New York City public financing system. So I actually think he did influence the debate. It could have been bigger, though.
Now, last night, Oren, there were election returns. This is not the biggest election day in history, but there were some interesting things. And maybe the most interesting was the victory of Tea Party candidate for governor of Kentucky, Mark Bevin, who had run very hard against Obamacare. They've had Democratic governors in Kentucky, despite having Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell as their senators. How much of a bellwether do you think this is for anything?
Well, I don't think it's much of a bellwether, especially when you look at turnout in the race, especially these not only off-cycle congressional years, but off-cycle years tend to be driven by the bases of the parties, those who can really be turned out to vote. I think the most important thing it shows is just how much President Obama has weakened the Democratic Party in certain parts of the country. You know, the Kentucky Democratic Party at this point and what voters in Kentucky think Democrats stand for, with Obamacare and with other things the president has done, coal and so forth, is really at a place where they can't even hold the governorship in a race they probably should have won. Speaking
of money, as we were with Zephyr, Ben Carson, it looks like, has raised the most money recently, and mostly in small bites, something Lawrence Lessig would probably like. Some people are calling him the Jimmy Carter candidate. Like Carter's soft-spokenness was very welcome after the contentious Watergate and Vietnam era. Do you think there's a real parallel there?
I don't know that there's a parallel to Governor Carter, who at the time was, he certainly sounded different than a lot of the other candidates, but was obviously a very experienced politician. I think what people find appealing about Dr. Carson is more than anything, frankly, the way that he talks about the issues. I think there are a lot of very culturally conservative voters out there who feel like we'll call it the Jeb Bush wing of the Republican Party, doesn't really care about them or focus on their issues, and Ben Carson speaks as someone who really does.
I want to know from both of you whether this exchange between Carson and one of the moderators at the CNBC debate bothers you.
Maker of nutritional supplements with which you had a 10-year relationship. They offered claims that they could cure autism, cancer. They paid $7 million to settle a deceptive marketing lawsuit in Texas, and yet your involvement continued. Why?
Well, that's easy to answer. I didn't have an involvement with them. That is total propaganda. And this is what happens in our society, total propaganda. I did a couple of speeches for them. I did speeches for other people. They were paid speeches. It is absolutely absurd to say that I had any kind of a relationship with them. Do I take the product? Yes. I think it's a good product.
To be fair, you were on the homepage of their website with the logo over your shoulder.
If somebody put me on their homepage, they did it without my permission.
Does that not speak to your vetting process or judgment in any way?
No, it speaks to the fact that I don't know that it's going on. See, they know.
All right, so it sounds like the audience didn't like the follow-up question. I'll say honestly, to my ear, he said he had no involvement with them, and it was propaganda to say he did. And then he went on to say how he did, which is that he got paid by them for speeches. How did you hear that exchange?
Yeah, I think it's a perfectly fair line of questioning. I thought the line of questioning a couple weeks ago about whether Anderson Cooper was too tied to the Clinton Foundation was a fair line of questioning. That doesn't mean there aren't legitimate answers, but that especially, that all of these connections to companies are well within exactly what we should be asking about. Whose agenda are people pushing? And that said, I think there was, I'm a little bit sympathetic to some of the frustration, even as a watcher of the candidates, feeling like there was less of a focus on trying to get at real policy differences or real decision-making difference, and that isn't actually helpful for us as citizens necessarily.
Briefly on that one, your view?
No, I think it's a silly question. I mean, it's probably kind of a third-order opposition attack that someone has put out there. You know, if the candidates want to get into that fight, they can, but with the limited time in the debate, to make that the question is, it's reflection of a lot of things people were very upset at CNBC for.
You don't think if his credibility is based on his medical expertise and he's involved with what at least was being portrayed, I don't know them as a quack health products company, that's an important thing to ask him?
I think it's an interesting question. It should come up at some point in the campaign, but obviously it's not something that has been at the top of the campaign discussion. And to introduce it there when it's not something, frankly, at least I had heard of, I think a lot of very well-informed voters probably had no idea about. It's really the media deciding what they want the debate to be about as opposed to what the candidates and the voters are probably focused on.
All right. I was amused when Mr. You're Fired, Donald Trump, scolded moderator John Harwood for bad manners in asking a question. Maybe we'll see a less bombastic Trump looking for wider appeal that way. Let's watch this clip.
You've done very well in this campaign so far by promising to build a wall and make another country pay for it. Right. Send 11 million people out of the country. Cut taxes $10 trillion without increasing the deficit. Right. And make Americans better off because your greatness would replace the stupidity and incompetence of others.
That's right.
Let's be honest. Is this a comic book version of a presidential campaign?
It's not a comic book, and it's not a very nicely asked question the way you say that. Larry Kudlow, as an example, who I have a lot of respect for, loves my tax plan.
So first of all, Larry Kudlow, who's a conservative commentator for CNBC, I saw him confirm in the post-debate show on CNBC that he did say he liked Trump's tax plan. So for whatever that's worth. But do you think the cartoon character framing was out of bounds, considering the list of kind of superlative superhero performance promises that Harwood had ticked off?
I do. I think the problem is that it was just a rude question. It was essentially, first of all, making it about the moderator, not about the candidate, and trying to get attention and put somebody down. And that was by no means the only example of that. That kind of very, I would call it passive-aggressive questioning, carried over to the way that they asked Senator Rubio a number of questions about his age, about his finances, the way they asked Governor Bush about, whether he was letting his donors down. And it was really almost the subtext of the debate that I think was offending people more than the substance.
And we'll get to more of this when we continue with our evidence-based politics segment on media bias in a minute. But I want to make sure to touch on Jeb Bush, who seems to be really sinking in the polls and did badly in yet another debate by all accounts, and now says he's going to reboot the campaign, and I think the slogan is, I can fix it. Can he fix it?
I have to say that I saw a New Yorker satire saying that Bush had dropped out with the slogan, mission accomplished, and I think I was not the only one who actually didn't know it was satire. I think he's in really bad shape and hasn't shown a genuine interest in running and feels subservient instead of feeling like a leader. So I'm assuming I'm along with many other people that's ending.
Any different take?
I think that's right. I think the key point is, there are other people at comparable levels in the polls who you could see a path forward for. Governor Christie's an example. The challenge for Governor Bush is we've seen how he's performing. And if you project that forward a few more months, he's not going to go anywhere.
All right, now we're going to bring on some of the evidence about media bias, so stick around. Time for evidence-based politics. Today, understanding press bias. Let's begin with an accusation. In that GOP debate, Senator Marco Rubio was reminded of a scathing editorial against him in Florida's Sun-Sentinel newspaper that called for him to resign from the Senate for missing so many votes to campaign. Quoting the paper, the moderator asked, "Do you hate your job?" And this was Rubio's response.
Let me say, I read that editorial today with a great amusement. It's actually evidence of the bias that exists in the American media today.
But do you hate your job?
Let me answer your question on the Sun-Sentinel editorial today. Back in 2004, one of my predecessors to the Senate, by the name of Bob Graham, a Democrat, ran for president, missing over 30% of his votes. I don't recall them calling for his resignation.
Is that the standard?
Later that year, in 2004, John Kerry ran for president, missing close to 60 to 70% of his votes. I don't recall the Sun-Sentinel endorsed him. In 2008, Barack Obama missed 60 or 70% of his votes, and the same newspaper endorsed him again. So this is another example of the double standard that exists in this country between the mainstream media and the conservative media.
Is Senator Marco Rubio correct about press bias against conservatives? If so, when did the press turn left? In their analysis of the press, scholars often say bias is a matter of framing. So what's that? Joining us via Skype from Blacksburg, Virginia, Jim Kuypers, Professor of Communication at Virginia Tech and author of Partisan Journalism, A History of Media Bias in the United States. Welcome, Professor.
Oh, welcome. Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
And Zephyr and Oren, thanks for sticking around. What does that term framing mean, and how do you think it applies to questions surrounding last week's debate?
Well, framing is, at its heart, just a way that we make sense of all the information that comes at us in the world. And we narrow it down, and framing makes some aspects of reality more apparent than others. So it makes some facts more noticeable, other facts less noticeable.
So sometimes it's not whether the question assumes that they're cartoon character villains, as somebody put it, but just what the topic is. So somebody could be talking about criminal justice, for example, and ask, why is there so much police brutality? Somebody else could ask a question, why is there so much crime? And those are two different frames, right?
Yes, and it's generally when we think of media bias, we think of what Rubio was pointing out, which was an ideological bias. But there are other types of bias that operate that are larger. For instance, a money bias. The mainstream media is going to report on what's going to make money for them in terms of advertising.
Or maybe run a debate based on what's going to make money for them by being sensational enough to grab a big audience. Do you think that's some of what we've been seeing in several of the debates so far?
Well, I think so. I do think professionally that there is definitely some ideological bias going on there, but I also think that this has a lot to do with ratings and the got you and the fact that there's many more Republicans running right now than there are Democrats.
Where do you see ideological bias? I'll say that the response by Democrats to the charge of media bias against these Republican candidates is that Clinton and Sanders were asked challenging questions too, like, are you trustworthy to Clinton, and are you too far left as a socialist to Sanders?
Well, those are asking questions they can reply and affirm a positive outcome. There wasn't the accusation that they were this or that, in a sense, coming from the press. Whereas I think we saw a little bit more of that coming from the Republicans. those are the instances when we look overall and across time in politics, what we find is that now about 70% of Americans are actually saying that there is an intentional political bias by the mainstream press in this country. And that includes a sizable number of Democrats, too. So
do they see liberal bias or do they see other bias?
There's a large, about 60% of that is a liberal bias. Democrats do see less of that, but there are some that do see that, and primarily it's conservatives and moderates who feel that they're this. But earlier you had asked, when did the liberal bias begin? When did you start seeing the mainstream media turn left? And actually in the book that you mentioned, one of the studies in there looked at 1,500 mainstream media editorials from 1958 to 1970 on foreign policy and domestic issues. And we start seeing in the late 50s a shift from a more conservative orientation to a liberal orientation. In terms of policy, it was more readily apparent in social issues than foreign policy, but
if that's true, why do you think it turned, and why at that time?
I think in part of it was just the cultural change that occurred in the entire country, and we see the press coming into that, and we also see the youth starting to come into that discipline at that time. And so it was more of a cultural shift, and we see that in a lot of major institutions.
We just have about 3 minutes, but Zephyr Teachout, are you buying this liberal bias?
Well, I think anytime you use the language of bias, you have to have an idea of what a baseline unbiased is and where the liberal conservative line falls. So I think it's a really interesting research, but you'd want to know, well, is the baseline 70% marginal tax rate for the highest tax bracket, or is the baseline much lower? I do think that a lot of the questions, left and right, have been inflected, not necessarily with liberal bias, but with a kind of looking for attention bias, and that isn't helping us.
As we saw maybe in those clips.
Yeah.
Or in same question about liberal bias and how much you see it.
Well, I think it's definitely a significant factor. I think if you just take into account the political preferences of most of the people in the media, it would be hard to believe that there would not be some bias. And in fact, it would be those in the left traditionally who would be most likely to admit that that kind of bias in people's own views would leak through to their work. So I think it's pretty difficult to look at who is playing these roles and believe there's not bias. I do think you can separate that from how you moderate a debate. You could have 3 very liberal journalists conduct an excellent debate. Problem on CNBC is that they weren't being excellent journalists. They were trying to get attention and drive an agenda.
And that's not a liberal network. That's a Wall Street focused network, right?
That's certainly true. I think if you look at the people who were moderating the debate, certainly the fact that they are used to interviewing CEOs about earnings does not mean that they are not well left of center.
What do you both think, and Professor, I want to know from you too in Virginia, about one of the proposals that the Republican candidates group made after the debate. At least for a minute there was talk, I think this one fell apart, but that moderators of a Republican primary debate be people who have voted in Republican primaries in the past. Different in a general election, but if you're really trying to represent the primary electorate, that the moderator should be from that party. Do you like that?
I think it's something you could do. I think it's a lot less important than having experienced political journalists and interviewers. You know, NBC has people like Chuck Todd and David Gregory in their stable. I would describe them both as fairly liberal. I also would say they would have done a much, much better job than CNBC did. They
would probably dispute that their politics are on their sleeve at all. But Professor, what about this? I mean, this Friday night there's a Rachel Maddow moderated Democratic candidates forum, and I'm just guessing that a lot of Democrats think, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense.
Well, I'm of the school that go with an old-fashioned New England-style town hall moderator, or say, bring it on press, just give us the hardest questions you can and go in and then fight back, redirect the questions.
Which means that you agree with Oren that it shouldn't matter too much, that, you know, surveys show that a lot of the national media as individuals tend to vote Democratic. if they're doing their jobs as journalists, then they're going to be just as good debate moderators as if you had a more balanced core?
If they are trained, yes, they can do the job and hold any political point of view at all. I train advanced graduate students to do that all the time, so it can be done. But I think the Republicans could actually do a better job and just be more confrontational. If they don't like a question, redirect it. Say why. Get out there.
Zephyr, you ran for governor
Yes.
from the left of Andrew Cuomo in New York State.
Yes.
How do you feel you were treated by the press in terms of bias?
I think the biggest sort of source of bias is, which we all know, it's just in plain sight, is that you get covered based on how much money you've raised. Or the polling that comes from coverage itself. So there's a dynamic interaction that shuts out a lot of positive, a lot of really exciting candidates like Larry Lessig. But I actually think, the question isn't what debates should be. We should have all different kinds of debates. And they serve a function not just for the party, but for all of us. I do think there's lots of good possible kinds of debates, and then a few that aren't helpful. And the ones that aren't helpful are the ones that are accusatory instead of really uncovering important issues.
And Oren, last word. Next week we're going to see a Fox Business News / Wall Street Journal debate again of the Republican candidates. Do you think they're going to take any lessons from this and do something differently?
Well, I think we'll probably be back to what the first couple were. If you look at the first two debates before CNBC, one Fox News, I think the other was CNN.
Fox News is Fox News, and the candidates didn't like that either. They felt they were raked over the coals.
That's exactly right. I think Fox News was very tough, but again, they were raising interesting issues and confronting candidates, not being nasty about it. And that's what candidates want. Candidates can stand up for themselves. Frankly, the candidates didn't come out of the CNBC debate that badly. They looked pretty good in some instances, fighting with the moderators. What the candidates don't want is just the mean-spiritedness and the attacks for the sake of attacks.
The debates go on, and the debates over the debates go on. Thank you both very much for joining us. Professor, thank you very much for joining us with some of the historical perspective, and that's POTUS 2016 for today. We're here each week at this hour calling the presidential horse race and giving scholars a chance to throw some cold, hard facts at the overheated campaign rhetoric. 1 year to the finish line, Iowa and New Hampshire, 3 months, and next GOP debate Tuesday. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.